December 3rd, 1945, Sugamo Prison, Tokyo. Admiral Tuichihara's hand trembled slightly as he traced the kanji across yellowed sheets of paper. Outside, the ruins of Tokyo stretched endlessly, a city reduced to ash, twisted steel, and rubble. Once, a heart of ambition, culture, and national pride, the streets now lay fractured, the wooden beams of homes charred, bridges twisted, and the skeletal remains of factories standing as mute witnesses to devastation. Tuichihara, a veteran of 7 major naval engagements, had endured both victories and defeats. Yet, nothing had prepared him for the weight of realization pressing down upon him now. He had fought at the Philippine Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and Leyte Gulf, battles where courage collided with industrial might. Each loss had been a lesson, each victory a fleeting balm. But the truth that now consumed him was not about individual courage or strategy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was about the stark, unyielding arithmetic of war, the enemy's capacity to replace, rebuild, and overwhelm. He wrote carefully, every stroke deliberate. The Americans replace losses faster than we can ever hope to tally victories. We are not merely fighting a fleet, we are confronting the very tide of steel, oil, and production. Every engagement is a delaying act against inevitability. We are overwhelmed. Through the small barred window, Tuichihara could glimpse the harbor beyond. The U.S. fleet lay gleaming under the weak winter sun, a silent demonstration of scale and efficiency that Japan could not hope to replicate. Battleships and carriers, far larger and more numerous than any Japanese imagination had allowed, floated in neat formations. Sailors scurried along decks, oiling pistons, polishing turrets, and preparing the machines of war. Each vessel contained more steel than entire Japanese cities had possessed in peacetime, each gun turret a monument to production, each propeller a testament to logistical might. For Tuichihara, watching this fleet was both hypnotic and horrifying. Every day spent observing these ships reaffirmed the futility of resistance. No maneuver, no daring strike, no kamikaze attack could match the relentless rhythm of replacement, replenishment, and expansion. He remembered the warnings of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, written decades earlier after his years of study in the United States and at Harvard University. Yamamoto had returned to Japan in the late 1920s, his mind sharpened by an intimate understanding of industrial potential, and he had seen clearly what Tokyo refused to acknowledge. American factories, he had predicted, would crush Japan if war came. The shipyards of the West Coast, the assembly lines in Detroit, the sprawling oil fields in Texas, all were instruments in a machine far larger than any Japanese calculations of courage or skill. Yet, by 1941, political pride and the illusion of martial superiority had silenced caution. Yamamoto's reports were shelved, dismissed, and ridiculed in bureaucratic offices filled with men who preferred ritual and tradition to truth. Tuichihara's memories returned to the day he had first boarded the Yamato, the pride of the Japanese Navy, on the eve of its commissioning in 1941. The massive hull, a marvel of engineering, had seemed unstoppable at the time. The wooden deck smelled of freshly varnished planks, and the brass fittings gleamed under the afternoon sun. Officers had discussed strategy with solemn pride, plotting maneuvers that they believed would outmatch any American fleet. But even then, Tuichihara remembered a quiet, gnawing doubt. He had glanced at the blueprints showing armor thickness, firepower, and displacement, and compared them silently to intelligence reports from Pearl Harbor. The numbers did not lie. America's industrial capacity was immense. The Japanese fleet, despite its elegance and discipline, was fragile when measured against the sheer scale of production that the United States could bring to bear. Even the tools of war carried a weight of inevitability. Aircraft, engines, and shells, all produced in numbers America could sustain. Japan could not. A single American aircraft factory could turn out more planes in a month than all of Japan's combined arsenals. B-29 bombers, each costing $639,000, more than the total budget of some Japanese prefectures, rolled off the assembly lines with a speed and precision that Japan's workshops could only envy. The idea that skill, courage, and ingenuity alone could counter such production now seemed almost naive. War, Tuichihara realized, was not won merely on the decks of ships or in the air. It was won in factories, in oil fields, and in the endless churn of steel and labor. He recalled the harrowing reports from Midway in June of 1942, when Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Courage had not failed, strategy had not failed, numbers had failed them. The United States replaced every loss within the year, while Japan could not hope to replace even a single experienced pilot. Every daring sortie, every meticulously planned torpedo attack was swallowed by a relentless tide of resources the Japanese could not match. That realization had marked the first moment when Tuichihara understood the war was no longer a contest of valor, but a contest of arithmetic beyond human scale. The diary continued. We fought well, yet our victories were ephemeral, like shadows in the sun. Our losses were permanent, while their replacements were inexhaustible. We are not defeated by enemies who fight harder, but by the very capacity of a nation to continue fighting long after we have faltered. In the quiet of his cell, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a city that had once pulsed with life, Tuichihara traced the kanji again. The words formed a final testament. Tokyo lies in ruin. The fleet we cherished, the soldiers we trained, the pilots we groomed. None can withstand the arithmetic of production. We are dwarfed. History will remember our courage, yet it will be shaped by the truth of scale. We fought as men, but America fought as an industry, and an industry cannot be defeated. Outside, the wind carried the smell of charred wood and rusted steel through the prison bars. The sun, weak and pale, fell across the twisted remains of the harbor, illuminating a single rusted anchor half buried in debris. For Tuichihara, it was both a relic of pride and a silent admonition of futility. Every day he spent in Sugamo Prison, observing the harbor and remembering the campaigns, reaffirmed the bitter truth. Japan had gambled with honor and skill, yet the sheer weight of industrial power had made defeat inevitable. He paused to look at a small wooden model of a battleship he had carved during his confinement, a piece he had meticulously detailed with tiny gun turrets, deck fittings, and a miniature anchor chain. It was the only artifact of control he possessed in a world dictated by forces too large for any one man to influence. He ran his fingers along the painted hull and whispered quietly, "We fought with everything we had, yet courage alone cannot match steel, oil, and factories. History will judge us kindly for our bravery, but truth will judge the numbers." December 3rd ended quietly. The harbor remained still, the fleet gleaming under a pale winter sun, indifferent to the ruined city behind it. Tuichihara sat with his diary open, tracing the kanji one last time before closing it carefully. Outside, the wind carried a mixture of ash and hope. Tokyo would be rebuilt. Japan would rise again. Yet, for one man in a cell, the lessons of war, loss, and the inexorable power of industry were indelibly written, etched across paper, steel, and memory. In the dim light of his cell, Admiral Tuichihara opened his diary once more. The pages worn and yellowed, filled with meticulous entries, recording a truth too heavy for pride to bear. He dipped his brush into the thick black ink, and as it met paper, he began to catalogue the numbers that had slowly, inexorably shattered Japan's illusion of parity. One page alone listed production statistics that would make even the bravest officer recoil in disbelief. Aircraft produced per month: United States, 7,200. Japan, 650. Aircraft engines per month: United States, 18,000. Japan, 1,200. Trained pilots per year: United States, 12,000. Japan, 300. Warships launched per year: United States, 48. Japan, 3. Merchant ships per year: United States, 140. Japan, 8. Each figure was more than ink on paper. It was a prophecy of inevitability, a precise accounting of a tide that no courage could stem. Tuichihara paused, staring at the lines, and the brush felt heavier in his hand. He remembered Guadalcanal, where losses on both sides had seemed roughly equivalent. Yet, within 6 months, the United States returned stronger, its fleet larger, more resilient, its production lines humming like an inexorable heartbeat. Japan's victories, if they could even be called that, were temporary delays, gestures of defiance against a machine of endless replacement. The diary recorded the psychological toll on the Japanese officers who had faced these truths firsthand. Vice Admiral Sakichi Takagi had once muttered in disbelief during a planning session, his fingers tapping nervously against the map table. "If these numbers are even half true, we are already defeated." Tuichihara had nodded silently, because he knew they were not half true. They were conservative, sanitized for bureaucratic consumption, yet still horrifying. He recalled the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japan had assembled 9 carriers and 473 aircraft. Against them, America brought 15 carriers and 956 aircraft. Japanese pilots averaged fewer than 200 flight hours, while American pilots possessed a minimum of 600. Even with unmatched bravery, the Japanese fleet was outpaced, outnumbered, and ultimately outclassed. He turned the page, revealing diagrams he had drawn to illustrate the disparity. Pencil lines traced the silhouettes of carriers, the wingspans of aircraft, the displacement of battleships, and the fuel requirements for each vessel. Beside each sketch, he had scribbled notes. One B-29 consumes more fuel than an entire regional depot can supply in a month. One bomber contains 55,000 precision parts. Cost exceeds most government buildings. Tuichihara recalled the terror in the eyes of those who watched the B-29 raids over Tokyo. Fire rained from above, consuming wooden homes, cultural treasures, and warehouses stacked with rice and textiles. Factories turned to rubble. Entire districts disappeared in a single night. Tuichihara wrote in the margin, "This is not war, this is arithmetic." Beyond statistics, the diary reflected the human dimension of this imbalance. Pilots trained to the peak of endurance and skill were lost in numbers that could never be replaced. A single American pilot downed might be mourned, but 2 could be replaced within weeks. Japan could not hope to replenish even a fraction of its losses. Sailors manning anti-aircraft guns endured sleepless nights, their hands blistered from continuous operation, yet every bullet fired seemed to vanish into a sky dominated by industrial-scale warfare. The B-29s returned night after night, their precise bombing runs guided by instruments that Japan had no means to replicate. Tuichihara drew small sketches of each aircraft, noting in detail the complexity of their engines, the armor plating, the fuselage design, and the bombs carried. One sheet detailed a single raid over Marunouchi, showing the radius of destruction from incendiary bombs, with annotations describing the cost of reconstruction, measured in months of labor, tons of steel, and metric tons of rice diverted from civilian consumption. Each note reinforced the same conclusion. The war was no longer a contest of valor, but a calculation of material, a scale Japan could not balance. The diary also contained personal artifacts, carefully preserved to anchor memory against the tide of numbers. A piece of shredded pilot's uniform, stitched into a small square, marked with the date June 6, 1944, served as a reminder of young men sent into hopeless engagements. Tuichihara had sketched the camouflage patterns on the sleeves, noting the quality of stitching and the fabric's resilience. Beside it, a fragment of shell casing, slightly deformed, was glued to the page, each indentation mapped and measured. The annotations described its origin, the gun that fired it, and the trajectory that had killed an officer during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. These were not mere relics. They were a visual accounting of lives and machinery intertwined in a ledger of loss. He remembered conversations with junior officers, men of 22, 23, whose excitement at serving their country had been replaced by exhaustion and fear. "We fight," one had whispered, voice barely audible over the din of anti-aircraft fire. "But it is like throwing water against a storm." Tuichihara had no words, only the quiet acknowledgement of truth. The storm was not elemental. It was manufactured, calculated, relentless. Production lines ran day and night, replacing ships, engines, planes, and crews. The arithmetic of war was cold, precise, and indifferent to human valor. Tuichihara's diary detailed one small, haunting incident during the Mariana Islands campaign. A squadron of Japanese Zero fighters, 12 and in number, had been dispatched to intercept an American formation of 40 B-21s. 7 Zeros were shot down within minutes, and the remaining 5 returned heavily damaged. Yet within a month, the United States had replaced every bomber, reinforcing the fleet with additional aircraft that Japan's could not match. The officer in charge of the squadron had written a letter describing the encounter, now carefully pasted into Tuichihara's diary. Tuichihara had annotated the margins. "We engage in acts of courage, yet the numbers render them ephemeral. One life, one plane, one gunship, insufficient to alter a tide quantified in thousands." The diary contained tables, painstakingly drawn, comparing fuel consumption per vessel, production timelines, and replacement rates. The figures read like a ledger of inevitability. For every battleship lost by Japan, 2 could be replaced by America in the same time frame. For every carrier sunk, fake aircraft carriers could be launched. For every experienced pilot lost, 12 new aviators, trained and certified within months. Tuichihara added notes about the psychological burden these calculations imposed on officers. Many had broken quietly, their morale eroded by knowledge that every sacrifice was, in statistical terms, inadequate. Tuichihara recalled Vice Admiral Takagi's words again, already defeated. They had been spoken with disbelief, yet with clarity. Tuichihara had known even then that arithmetic would claim victory before courage could. He documented further evidence in the diary, a map illustrating the radius of the B-29 bombing campaigns, with Tokyo at the center, and concentric circles marking population, fuel depots, and industrial zones destroyed. Beside each circle, he noted the number of American bombers required, the weight of ordnance dropped, and the replacement cost measured in yen and labor hours. These calculations confirmed the same inexorable truth. Japan could neither produce nor rebuild fast enough to challenge American scale. Tuichihara wrote extensively about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, noting the disparity between Japanese and American forces. Japan deployed 3 carriers, 68 ships, and 470 aircraft. America fielded 7 carriers, 160 ships, and 850 aircraft. Japanese pilots, averaging less than 200 flight hours, faced American pilots with 600 hours or more. The diary described individual skirmishes in vivid detail, tracing each maneuver, each missed torpedo, each flaring anti-aircraft salvo. Yet, the broader pattern was unavoidable. Even with tactical brilliance, every Japanese maneuver was destined to meet a counterweight of production scale and supply lines far beyond their capacity. The diary also chronicled smaller yet telling examples. Merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and medical supplies were frequently sunk by American submarines, yet replacement vessels arrived faster than Japan could document their losses. Tuichihara drew charts showing supply routes, distances, and tonnage, lost versus tonnage replaced. One table showed that for every 8 Japanese merchant ships lost, the United States launched 140 new vessels annually. The arithmetic was brutal and unavoidable. Beyond the numbers, Tuichihara reflected on the psychological effect on civilians and soldiers alike. Families in Tokyo and Osaka endured rationing, air raids, and constant fear, yet the industrial machine of America continued unabated. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles churned out warships, aircraft, and munitions with a speed and consistency that Japan could not imagine in peacetime. Each evening, the glow of fires in ruined Tokyo reminded him that industrial power, more than any fleet or pilot, determined the outcome of the conflict. Tuichihara concluded the chapter in his diary with a single stark sentence: "Courage is not enough. Skill is insufficient. Only scale, production, and relentless arithmetic dictate victory." He closed the diary and set it aside, glancing at the small artifacts that accompanied it: a bent propeller from a downed Zero, a fragment of an American shell, a tiny piece of cockpit glass from a B-29. Each represented a life, a calculation, a number in the ledger of war that could not be ignored. Outside, the winter sun reflected off the U.S. fleet in the harbor, its scale and organization indifferent to ruin, to courage, to human despair. Tuichihara sat silently, knowing that history would remember the bravery of men. Yet it was the arithmetic that had truly killed. Admiral Tuichihara's diary entries shifted from mere numbers to a narrative that chronicled the desperate feats of logistics and human endurance that defined Japan's final struggles. Leyte Gulf and the Mariana Islands became theaters not only of battle, but of an impossible race against industrial power. Japanese destroyers navigated a perilous web of Allied patrols, attempting to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to scattered garrisons. Each vessel carried only a fraction of what was required, often burning precious fuel just to transport a few tons of supplies. Tuichihara compared one small Liberty ship to 10 destroyers combined. The single vessel could deliver more in a single run than the combined efforts of 10 of Japan's fastest ships. He sketched the cargo layouts in his diary, noting the efficiency of loading and unloading in American ports. The diagrams showed a meticulous planning system Japan could not emulate. Each crate accounted for, each ton measured, every minute stained, representing lives preserved or machinery sustained. He recorded the despair that crept into the minds of commanders and engineers, men who understood the depth of the chasm between Japan and America. Their technical knowledge revealed not only tactical limitations, but the structural impossibility of matching American production. Welding technology, shipyard capacity, and raw material availability were inadequate. One senior engineer, noted with reverence in Tuichihara's diary, had muttered quietly while inspecting a hull, "An American welder can complete a ship section in hours that would take us days. Their assembly lines produce an entire destroyer while we fight over a single hull." Tuichihara's ink traced schematics of ship assembly, comparing Japanese rivet and weld patterns with the mechanized precision of American lines. Every illustration reinforced the same truth: Japan could not compete in scale, speed, or efficiency. The despair was compounded by the recognition that courage alone could never close a tenfold industrial gap. Tuichihara detailed morale and human cost with equal precision. Japanese sailors, pilots, and engineers worked with unyielding loyalty and discipline, often laboring for 24 hours with minimal rest. Rations were meager, fuel shortages, forced improvisation, and delayed operations. Exhaustion became a constant companion. He included in the diary fragments of letters from officers, preserved with careful annotation. One young lieutenant, aged 24, wrote of sleeping on decks while ships were repaired, of witnessing comrades faint from hunger, of the terror of facing American aircraft with guns that jammed from overuse. Meanwhile, the American forces operated with abundance. Fuel, munitions, replacement personnel, and infrastructure were readily available. Each campaign Tuichihara chronicled became a mathematical inevitability. Battles were no longer contests of strategy alone, but calculations of supply, production, and replacement. Every engagement, from the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, revealed a relentless truth. No amount of courage or ingenuity could overcome a tenfold disparity in industrial power. Even the kamikaze pilots, whose exploits would later be mythologized, were evidence of desperation rather than triumph. Tuichihara's diary preserved careful statistics. By the time of the Battle of Okinawa, Japan had launched nearly 1,900 kamikaze attacks. These missions sank 36 ships and damaged hundreds more, yet each loss inflicted upon the Americans was mitigated by production lines working at full speed. Liberty ships alone, a class of mass-produced cargo vessel, produced 500,000 tons of shipping per month, whereas Japan could barely produce 500,000 tons annually across its entire empire. Tuichihara drew sketches of aircraft loaded with explosives, noting the weight distribution, fuel capacity, and flight path calculations. Each diagram served as a chilling testament. Even extraordinary individual heroism could not overcome industrial arithmetic. The diary also chronicled improvised solutions attempted by Japanese engineers to bridge the production gap. Makeshift aircraft carriers were converted from merchant hulls, destroyers stripped of armaments to carry cargo, and even fishing boats pressed into service to transport fuel along shallow channels. Tuichihara measured and recorded these improvisations with clinical detail. He annotated the speed of conversion, the limitations of hull integrity, and the logistical strain on crews. Each entry was accompanied by sketches of hull modifications, crude but functional, and notes on fuel consumption and operational range. Despite ingenuity, the arithmetic remained unforgiving. Each improvisation, delayed by hours or days, represented a material advantage lost to the Americans. Tuichihara described the strain on training programs as another facet of Japan's impossible race. Pilot instruction, accelerated due to necessity, produced aviators with fewer than 150 hours of flight experience by the time they were deployed. Engineers and gunners received limited practical training, yet were expected to operate complex machinery under duress. In contrast, American pilots and crews underwent rigorous programs, ensuring a minimum of 600 flight hours and extensive simulated and live combat experience. Tuichihara's diary included comparative charts, meticulously drawn, showing training hours per month, replacement rates for casualties, and attrition curves. These tables revealed the inevitability of loss. Japanese personnel were outmatched not only by numbers, but by preparation. Even acts of exceptional skill could not overcome the sheer weight of American production and training. One of the most haunting sections of the diary recounted the logistical efforts during the Leyte campaign. Tuichihara described convoys running along narrow, mined channels under constant threat of submarine attack and air raids. Destroyers carried just a few tons of ammunition each, often at the cost of consuming double that weight in fuel for the journey. Each mission required careful calculation, constant vigilance, and the willingness to sacrifice vessels for small gains. In contrast, American convoys, protected by an armada of escorts, could deliver thousands of tons in a single trip. Tuichihara drew maps marking the routes, distances, fuel consumption, and cargo tonnage, each arrow a notation, reflecting a calculus of desperation. The diary's margins were filled with notes. One Liberty ship delivers what 10 destroyers cannot. Speed, protection, and mass are decisive. Courage cannot substitute for tonnage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Tuichihara also recounted acts of ingenuity by officers seeking to stretch limited resources. Torpedoes were salvaged from sunken vessels, engines cannibalized for spares, and rations redistributed to ensure priority personnel could operate machinery. Even these measures, however, were temporary fixes. The diary included diagrams of modified engine rooms, showing how parts from multiple ships were combined to restore a single operational vessel. Fuel lines were rerouted, electrical systems rewired, and storage compartments modified. Each modification was painstakingly documented, with measurements, sketches, and calculations of effectiveness. Tuichihara noted, in quiet despair, that while these acts of engineering ingenuity were impressive, they were unable to offset the structural disadvantages imposed by Japan's limited industrial base. The human toll of this impossible race was relentless. Crews suffered from malnutrition, fatigue, and psychological strain. Tuichihara preserved small artifacts within the diary. Fragments of ration tins, worn boots, and letters written in the margins of service manuals. Each artifact carried a story. One pair of boots, repaired 3 times with thread and metal scraps, had traveled thousands of miles along the Pacific, surviving storms, combat, and saltwater. Letters described hunger, fear, and exhaustion, yet also loyalty, courage, and determination. Tuichihara's annotations often noted the contrast. American crews possessed abundance, morale bolstered by sufficient food, fuel, and rest, whereas Japanese crews endured privation while maintaining discipline. The arithmetic of supply dictated outcomes as much as bullets or bombs, a lesson no officer could ignore. Tuichihara's diary also addressed the psychological effect of witnessing the relentless American industrial machine. From the harbor in Manila to the ports of Okinawa, he recorded the efficiency of shipyards, assembly lines, and repair depots. Battleships repaired in days that Japan required months to reconstruct. Aircraft returned to service after routine maintenance at a pace impossible for Japanese facilities. Each observation was accompanied by sketches and tables comparing repair times, labor input, and output tonnage. Tuichihara commented, "We fight with the skill and courage of a handful of men, yet they replace thousands with ease. The race is not of valor, but of numbers, and we are behind by tenfold." Even during the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, Tuichihara documented the strategic choices imposed by scarcity. Fuel shortages, limited fleet maneuvers, aircraft could not patrol effectively, and torpedoes were deployed sparingly. The diary described missions planned with precision, yet constrained by the reality of limited resources. He drew maps showing patrol coverage, flight paths, and expected enemy contact, noting how each operation was handicapped by supply limits. Meanwhile, American forces executed overlapping campaigns with redundancy built in. No single loss affected operational capability. Tuichihara's ink captured the despair. Japan's planning could not compete with American capacity, and the result was inevitable. The diary's final pages, in this section, included reflections on kamikaze operations. Tuichihara noted that nearly 1,900 attacks by suicide pilots were launched by Okinawa, sinking 36 ships and damaging hundreds more. Yet each ship lost was replaced almost immediately. American Liberty ship production alone generated 500,000 tons monthly. He sketched the aircraft, noting explosive loads, fuel, and estimated impact. Even the extreme measure of sacrifice, the willingness to die in attack, was rendered mathematically insufficient. Courage could not substitute for mass, skill could not replace scale, and human valor alone could not overcome a system that produced at 10 times Japan's rate. Tuichihara closed the diary with a reflection. The war had become a race, not of tactics, not of bravery, not of honor, but of arithmetic. Scale, production, and logistics dictated victory. Individual heroism mattered, but it mattered only within a system that could sustain it, and Japan's system was incapable of doing so. Each sketch, each table, each fragment of a letter or uniform preserved the reality of the impossible race fought by men and machines alike. Outside the cell, the harbor reflected American power, ships gleaming in the sun, endless replacement lines humming with precision. Tuichihara sat quietly, brush in hand, understanding that while history would remember courage, it was arithmetic, not heroism, that had determined the outcome. By late 1945, Admiral Tuichihara and his peers found themselves confined within the grey walls of Sugamo Prison, a facility that held men whose honor had been both their shield and their cage. The once unshakable codes of Bushido now met the relentless logic of defeat, and confessions flowed like ink from trembling brushes. Officers who had commanded fleets and air wings for decades now recorded truths once censored by honor, protocol, and pride. The interrogations were meticulous, probing every detail of strategy, supply, and production, yet the evidence was undeniable. Japan had no capacity to replace lost carriers, aircraft pilots, or trained crews at a rate sufficient to challenge the United States. Every table, every diagram, every carefully annotated sketch pointed to the same inexorable conclusion. Once the Americans mobilized their full industrial might, victory was unattainable. Tuichihara's diary entries, written with a mixture of resignation and clarity, became a ledger not of triumph, but of impossibility. Each stroke of ink seemed heavier than the last, as though he were physically marking the weight of Japan's industrial inadequacy on the page. He recalled the Pearl Harbor reconnaissance, how carefully Japan had studied the harbor and how miscalculations had left the Pacific Fleet largely intact. The attack achieved temporary tactical surprise, yet the Americans retained their oil storage facilities, repair depots, and auxiliary vessels. In hindsight, these omissions were critical. The diary contained meticulous sketches of the harbor, noting the locations of fuel tanks, dry docks, and repair yards that remained unscathed. Midway followed, an even more devastating confirmation of arithmetic over audacity. 4 carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were lost in a single engagement. Tuichihara meticulously recorded the sequence of events, the deployment of aircraft, the timing of scouting planes, the defensive maneuvers, and ultimately the sinking of the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. Within weeks, the Americans had replaced these losses, reinforcing the carriers with experienced crews, aircraft, and repair resources that Japan could never replicate. His diary charts compared the replacement rates. America launched 15 new carriers and hundreds of aircraft in the span of a few months, while Japan struggled to replace a single vessel with undertrained crews. The arithmetic was cruel, indisputable, and unforgiving. Guadalcanal, Leyte, and the Marianas campaigns were similarly chronicled. Each page of the diary presented not only battle outcomes, but production data, logistical reports, and schematics of aircraft and vessels lost or damaged. Tuichihara recorded the numbers with quiet horror. Aircraft produced per month, United States, 7,200. Japan, 650. Aircraft engines per month, United States, 18,000. Japan, 1,200. Trained pilots per year, United States 12,000, Japan 300, warships launched per year, United States 48, Japan 3, merchant ships per year, United States 140, Japan 8. Every figure was more than a statistic. It was a verdict, a mathematical proof that human skill, bravery, and tactical ingenuity were powerless against sheer industrial scale. Officers in confinement whispered among themselves, acknowledging in muted tones what had been impossible to say aloud. We were defeated not by skill, but by arithmetic. These confessions, inscribed in ink, became artifacts of reckoning, their margins filled with annotations, diagrams, and reflections on human cost. Yamamoto's prophetic words, preserved in Tuichihara's diary, resonated with new clarity. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, the Admiral had warned decades earlier, it would not be enough that we take Guam or Hawaii. We would have to march into Washington itself to dictate peace. Do our politicians understand the final outcome? By 1943, Japan's leaders had no illusions. Yet, decisions driven by pride and nationalistic fervor had already set the course toward inevitable confrontation. Tuichihara reflected on these warnings, his brush tracing Yamamoto's kanji as though the act of writing could exercise the weight of foresight ignored. He compared Yamamoto's notes with reports from the field, revealing the growing chasm between intention and reality. Each battle, each loss, and each failed replenishment of materiel underscored the same inescapable truth. Strategy alone could not counter production capacity measured in tens of thousands of aircraft, ships, and trained personnel. Technological innovation, though pursued feverishly, could not bridge the divide. Tuichihara documented the superiority of American aircraft with precise diagrams. Hellcats outclassed the famed Mitsubishi Zeros in speed, armor, and firepower. Radar systems, radar-directed bombers, and precision-guided munitions gave the Americans situational awareness that Japanese forces could not match. Tuichihara illustrated the differences, sketching wing profiles, engine layouts, and cockpit instrumentation, comparing range, payload, and maneuverability. Even the most advanced Japanese developments, Type 0 fighters, long-range reconnaissance planes, and torpedo bombers, were insufficient when faced with a foe who could replace losses daily and innovate faster than Japan could produce. Every diagram, chart, and annotation reinforced a single lesson. The Pacific War was decided not by tactics alone, but by industrial and economic inevitability. Tuichihara's diary also revealed the human dimension of these confessions. He recorded the psychological toll on officers forced to confront the arithmetic of defeat. There were testimonies from captains who admitted that their pride had blinded them, from engineers who confessed to knowing the futility of attempting to match American production, and from pilots who acknowledged the impossibility of sustaining sorties against numerically superior formations. The diary included sketches of exhausted faces, notes on rations, and measurements of fuel consumption, each entry blending technical data with the lived reality of men at the end of a losing campaign. One young officer, aged 26, wrote in Tuichihara's notebook, "Margins of seeing friends perish while fuel shortages grounded aircraft, of witnessing destroyers scuttle under bombardment, and of the despair of knowing that replacements would not arrive in time, if at all." The diary preserved small artifacts as silent witnesses to these confessions. Tuichihara affixed fragments of ration tins, splintered cockpit panels, and worn boots, each labeled with dates and campaign details. A bent propeller, recovered from a downed reconnaissance aircraft, bore scratches from emergency landings and enemy fire. Next to it, he sketched diagrams comparing its thrust output to that of an American Hellcat engine. Each artifact was a testament to both human ingenuity and limitation. He noted, even in creativity and courage, the odds were insurmountable. Material deficiency dictated fate. These physical remnants underscored what the diagrams and statistics had already proved. Victory was unattainable against an enemy whose industrial output and logistical capacity exceeded imagination. Tuichihara also examined the failures of strategic planning that arose from misunderstanding these realities. Pearl Harbor had been audacious, yet incomplete. Midway demonstrated the fragility of Japan's numerical strength. Guadalcanal revealed logistical incapacity. Leyte and the Marianas campaigns highlighted the futility of temporary tactical victories. Each chapter in the diary documented how brave maneuvers were overwhelmed by replacement, production, and scale. One page illustrated the comparative speed of repairs. An American aircraft carrier damaged by torpedoes could return to combat in 6 weeks, while Japanese vessels required months, if not years, for similar restoration. Ships scuttled to prevent capture only delayed, but did not prevent American reinforcements. Tuichihara's diagrams mapped these timelines, showing the inexorable convergence of arithmetic and fate. Even in captivity, Tuichihara reflected on the philosophical implications of these confessions. Honor and protocol, long considered inviolable, were now subordinate to the brutal calculations of industry. The diary contained musings on the paradox of courage. Bravery mattered, yet only within a system capable of sustaining it. Kamikaze missions, once romanticized, were documented with numerical rigor. By Okinawa, nearly 1,900 attacks sank 36 ships and damaged hundreds more. Yet, the American Liberty ship program replaced lost tonnage 500,000 tons per month. Tuichihara sketched aircraft loadouts, trajectories, and detonation zones, noting with quiet despair that even extraordinary self-sacrifice could not alter the outcome dictated by arithmetic. Finally, the diary reflected on the broader lessons of captivity and confession. Tuichihara recorded conversations with fellow officers, debates on strategy, reflections on misjudged enemy capacity, and acknowledgements of pride misplaced. He preserved diagrams of failed operations, annotated timelines of fleet movements, and even included rudimentary flowcharts showing replacement cycles, production schedules, and training programs. Every entry was a fusion of human experience and numerical inevitability, a record that both documented and explained the ultimate futility of Japan's war effort. As he closed each section, his brush lingered on the page, leaving deliberate strokes that conveyed the weight of understanding, regret, and acceptance. Tuichihara's final confessions emphasized a single, undeniable truth. Japan's defeat was neither shameful nor ignoble, yet it was predetermined by forces beyond heroism, courage, or strategy. Victory had become impossible once America had mobilized its industrial and economic might to full capacity. Every battle lost, every carrier sunk, every pilot slain had contributed to a calculus that could not be overturned. The diary, preserved with meticulous care, became a testament to arithmetic over valor, a record of confessions that transformed personal pride into historical clarity. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on, yet within Sugamo, these records remained, indelible artifacts of human courage, confronted by the immutable laws of production and logistics. Admiral Tuichihara's final entries reveal a transformation from anger and disbelief to measured reflection. He documented the courage of men who faced certain death with unwavering resolve. Officers who risked their lives during night sorties, engineers who improvised machinery with limited materials, and sailors who navigated treacherous waters under constant threat of bombardment. Every anecdote was paired with diagrams of vessels, sketches of engines, and fragments of destroyed equipment, turning his diary into a tangible record of human endeavor. Yet, amid these accounts, Tuichihara noted a sobering truth. Even the greatest valor could not compete with an adversary capable of producing in a single month what Japan could barely manufacture in a year. Aircraft, engines, trained pilots, and warships multiplied with mechanical certainty beyond imagination, each figure a silent witness to inevitable defeat. He recorded the surrender broadcast of Emperor Hirohito on August 15, 1945, capturing the quiet, almost imperceptible acknowledgement among his peers that the war had been effectively decided long before the atomic bombs fell. Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Marianas had served as milestones, yet each confirmed a single relentless fact: industrial capacity dictated victory. In his final reflection, he wrote, "We fought with honor, skill, and loyalty, yet our enemy fought with numbers, steel, and unyielding production. To compete with that, courage alone is insufficient. The war was lost before it was waged. The record of our failure is not shame, but truth." Tuichihara placed his brush down beside a small fragment of a torpedo fin, a splintered section of hull, and a worn leather boot, each artifact labeled with dates and campaigns, silent witnesses to the human cost of arithmetic. Looking out the barred window at the ruined city, he traced with his eyes the remnants of temples, shattered rooftops, and charred streets, and glimpsed the fragile light of dawn. Beyond the ashes, he saw the outline of a new world, one shaped not by heroism or devotion, but by factories, assembly lines, and the unrelenting calculus of production, where human courage, however great, was a single equation in a ledger dominated by steel, oil, and numbers. Years after the guns fell silent, historians and military analysts pored over Admiral Tuichihara's meticulously kept diary, his pages yellowed, edges frayed, and margins annotated with sketches of aircraft, ship diagrams, and fragments of torpedo fins. Each entry, once a private reckoning, became canonical evidence of the industrial gulf that defined the Pacific War. Analysts marveled at the details. Aircraft replaced tenfold, Liberty ships launched faster than entire Japanese fleets, engines mass-produced with precision, trained pilots and engineers generated by the thousands, while Japan struggled to maintain a mere trickle. One page displayed a hand-drawn chart comparing American production of 7,200 aircraft per month to Japan's 650. Another depicted the staggering output of 18,000 aircraft engines for the United States against Japan's 1,200. Tuichihara's notes on warship launches, merchant shipping, and logistical planning were accompanied by small artifacts: a rusted propeller from a sunken destroyer, a fragment of a carrier deck, and a faded flight log, each item carefully labeled and dated, tangible proof of the numbers that had dictated fate. Admiral Tuichihara, now an old man with lined features and trembling hands, reflected quietly on the legacy he had preserved. He had chronicled truth where ideology, pride, and hope had failed. "The war was over before the last bombs fell," he murmured to visiting scholars, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "We could not compete with numbers, not because we were weak, but because our opponent could replace 10 for everyone. We lost. That is why we surrendered. That is why history remembers our courage, but not our victory." His words, once whispered in the isolation of Sugamo Prison, resonated through lecture halls and military academies where cadets traced his diagrams and studied the arithmetic that had made strategy futile. Tokyo's skyline decades later rose anew. Steel and glass towers replaced timber and stone, modern bridges spanned once-bombed rivers, and parks bloomed where fire had razed neighborhoods. Tuichihara passed away peacefully, surrounded by the diary, artifacts of naval campaigns, and letters from former comrades who had survived to tell the story. The diary remained preserved, a testament not to shame but to comprehension, a guide for generations. Wars are not won by valor alone, but by the unyielding capacity to outproduce the enemy. Courage and skill shape battles, but arithmetic shapes outcomes. The rusted hulls, fractured flight logs, and bent propellers he left behind spoke louder than any victory flag. And in that quiet truth lies the reason the war ended, not in heroics, but in numbers, a reality revealed in one admiral's steady hand, unwavering pen, and the unbroken discipline to record what others dared to ignore. Through ink, sketches, and fragments, history learned the cost of industrial imbalance, the immutable law that in the arithmetic of war, courage alone could never triumph over production. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.